We lead off with the NATO summit in Turkey, where Prime Minister Mark Carney is holding talks with other world leaders. Among a range of weighty issues, ongoing support for Ukraine as it faces a new wave of deadly Russian attacks. And on the sidelines of the summit, Carney has been meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
We're going to talk about some very specific initiatives around air defense and continued support through Pearl and other initiatives, building on very constructive conversations we had at the G7.
This NATO meeting comes at a uniquely tense time for the alliance. This is the first time the leaders have met since Donald Trump threatened to annex Greenland. There's also friction over Europe's refusal to help the U.S. in the Iran war. And leaders are also feeling the pressure to meet military spending targets while attempting to reduce their independence on the U.S. The summit continues into tomorrow, and the CBC's Evan Dyer has more now from Turkey's capital.
Prime Minister Carney met with both the winners and losers in the bidding contest to sell up to 12 submarines to Canada today. First, he met with Korean President Lee Jae-myung. His country's Hanwha Ocean failed in its bid to sell those submarines to Canada. Then he had a trilateral meeting with the winning countries, the German Chancellor and the Prime Minister of Norway. But we've seen Canadian officials being at pains here to stress that they still want to maintain a strategic relationship with South Korea, that they still consider it an important partner for the future. And that, of course, is the reason for that meeting. And at the same time, we know that South Korea remains very interested in selling military hardware to Canada, including, for example, armored vehicles. Another meeting here today was with President Volodymyr Zelensky, who often comes in person to these NATO summits, and this year came bringing a very urgent message that his country needs help with ballistic missile interceptors. Kiev has been attacked all week, and that's not actually unusual in the run-up to NATO summits. We sometimes see strong Russian air attacks on Ukraine. This week has been particularly aggressive. The Ukrainians have been successful in stopping a lot of the drone attacks, a lot of the cruise missile attacks, but are critically short of ballistic missile interceptors. Prime Minister Carney, in his readout of that meeting, said that they had discussed that very issue. Of course, Canada doesn't have such a technology itself, but has in the past contributed money to provide that technology, to buy it from the Americans who then deliver it to Ukraine. And we know that the two leaders, according to the Canadian readout, discussed a potential future package where Canada would do something similar again. Of course, Prime Minister Carney comes to this summit able to announce that Canada has finally met its 2% defence spending target, as well as being able to point to some of the specific uses for that money, to operationalize that money in the form of, for example, submarines. But that is now the floor here at NATO, and we've also heard a lot of talk about Canada reaching the new target being 5% by 2035. Canada says it's actually on track to get there a year early, potentially to even double its spending as soon as 2029 to get to 4%. We spoke with Defence Minister David McGuinty a short while ago and asked him, are the Canadian public ready for the kind of sacrifices that might entail, for the kind of trade-offs that kind of dramatically increased defence expenditure would imply for Canada? He says, yes, they are.
I think the Canadian people realize that there's been a lot of change. I think they realize that our geography no longer protects us as a matter of course. I think they saw through this recent war in Iran, that Iran, for example, deployed a missile which traveled over 5,000 kilometers, having announced to the world for 2.5 decades that they had no such capacity.
And in other defence-related news of great interest to Canada, NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte announced this morning that NATO is in talks to buy up to 10 of this aircraft that you see behind me here, which is the Saab Global Eye. Saab, of course, is a Swedish company, and they provide the avionics and the surveillance package for this aircraft. But the airframe is produced by Bombardier. It is, in fact, basically a Bombardier executive jet, which is manufactured in Canada. So that's some good news for that company and also for the Canadian economy. Evan Dyer, CBC News, Ankara.
Okay, so as we mentioned, this is the first time NATO leaders have met since U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to annex Greenland, and Trump is marking the occasion by reiterating that threat.
Greenland doesn't help Denmark. Denmark doesn't spend money to really help Greenland, but it's an important part for the United States. And it's surrounded by China ships and Russian ships. And that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It was Greenland that, and it continues to be, that should be controlled by the United States, not by Denmark. And when they wouldn't go along with it, and with all the money we spend to help them with Russia, And we don't have to spend any money. We could remove all of our soldiers out of Europe.
And when it comes to the U.S. president at the summit right now, we know there's nothing scheduled for an official meeting between Donald Trump and Canada's Prime Minister, either for today or tomorrow at this stage. Well, Trump has branded NATO a paper tiger that would cease to function without U.S. weapons and leadership. So what's the future of the alliance? Where does that leave Canada? For more on that, we've reached retired Vice Admiral Mark Norman in Ottawa. He's a former Vice Chief of the Defence Staff for the Canadian Armed Forces and a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Thank you for making time for us today.
Well, good morning, Arthi, and thanks for taking an interest in this topic.
You know, we've been talking a lot about shifting priorities within this country and a real focus on defense. Canada has hit NATO's 2% of gross domestic product spending target for the spring. Last spring, they hit that target for NATO. We know that the NATO Secretary General has even made mention of it quite recently. How does that position Canada within the alliance now?
Well, I think it allows Canada to speak with a little more confidence in terms of having met the minimum standard. And beyond that, certainly the indications from the Prime Minister himself and the government is that this is not just a one-time shot and that they intend to continue to grow the level of investment and that they're going to be there as a reliable partner for NATO. So I think it's encouraging and long overdue, but let's not lament the past.
So, of course, the spending is one of the issues that Canada has been contending with. We also know that, of course, the weapons, the supplies, the investment is another. We know that the Prime Minister named a German and Norwegian consortium, TKMS, as the preferred bidder for a fleet of submarines for the Royal Canadian Navy. And that was just ahead of this NATO summit. We also know that NATO has bet on Saab, giving Canada's global eye gamble a major boost as well. So how do those two decisions position Canada on a different front, not just the spending?
Yeah, so I think, Arthi, the best way to look at this is through two perspectives. One is cooperation and the other is industrial capacity. So one of the challenges facing NATO and, you know, with or without the United States in the context of industrial capacity is the fact that sadly the threats to the alliance, the threats to our way of life are growing faster than our collective capacity to respond to them. And this is why you're seeing a number of the conversations that are taking place in relation to Ukraine. And so it's important that Canada not only start buying more equipment and more capability, but also that Canada become more active as a participant in the production of those types of capabilities. Because legitimately, we're all in this together, and no one country has the solution to the kinds of problems that NATO is trying to face.
No one country might have the solutions, but certainly there is one country that is particularly loud about the criticisms about the alliance altogether. The United States has said, we mentioned that it's called NATO a paper tiger. It was very critical of the alliance when it came to whether or not there was any support or cooperation involving the Strait of Hormuz as well. I took note of the Minister of Defence's comments when he said geography no longer protects us as a matter of course. What did you make of that, and where are we seeing the actions behind those words?
Yeah, so this has been a long-standing concern of many of us who have been trying to convince previous governments that they have to take this stuff more seriously. And it reflects the reality that the kinds of threats that we're dealing with are no longer over there, although some of the kinetic activity, if you want to use Ukraine or Iran as examples, although it's happening over there, it's affecting us more and more. And more specifically, when we look at concerns about Russian expansion and aggression and increased activity by the Chinese government, particularly in the north, the reality is we're no longer immune from the kinds of threats that we're seeing affecting not only our friends and neighbors, but our way of life globally.
You know, finally, I do want to ask you again, because there is a voice that's quite loud at these summits and has been quite critical of the alliance, and that is Donald Trump, and that's on the issue of Greenland. He has already said, as this summit kicks off, that Greenland should be controlled by the U.S., not Denmark, and he's threatened we could remove all of our soldiers out of Europe. What do you make of that, and how would that impact Canada if he actually brings that to realization?
Well, okay, so let's break this into sort of two elements. The first is the U.S. contribution to European defense writ large, and it is significant. It can't be ignored. But equally, these types of threats are often not necessarily followed through. And I think in some respects, he has the collective attention of the political leadership of Europe and Canada by extension. So people are paying attention. They are upping their game, so to speak, in terms of defense capabilities. And although they're not able to completely replace American capability in some areas, they are able to certainly mitigate any potential reduction of U.S. capability in NATO. The second point is related specifically to Greenland. Ultimately, this is a lot of political bluster on the part of the president. We've seen this before. Nothing has changed. The reality strategically is that the United States does not need Greenland in the way that he characterizes it. There are some advanced technologies, radars and the like that could and probably should be based in Greenland to help contribute to continental defense of North America. But there's lots of existing mechanisms by which the United States and the Kingdom of Denmark can work together and give them the access they need. He just wants to continue to rattle cages and rattle sabers on this issue. And, to be honest, I think many people are just getting bored listening to this rhetoric.
Well, Mr. Norman, I want to thank you so much for your time today and your thoughts on all of these topics. I know we covered a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your time, Marthy. All the best.
That is retired Vice Admiral Mark Norman. He is a former Vice Chief of the Defence Staff for the Canadian Armed Forces. He joined us today from our nation's capital. Thank you again.
All right. All the best.